Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another beautiful afternoon at Google, and it's an exciting day. Today we are featuring at the Authors at Google program Kathryn Shevelow. Kathryn is a specialist in British literature, teaching at the University of California, San Diego. She'll be speaking to us today about her third book, which is actually on display here. It's called For the Love of Animals, which is about the rise of the animal protection movement. Our journey takes us back to the 16th and 18th century England, where authors, thinkers, and politicians offered a new view on animal welfare and also on social justice. The book traces the origins of the movement all the way up to the founding of the SPCA by William Wilberforce and Richard Martin. Changes in history prompt the revolutions that are part of today's time. This book has been very well received. It's actually quite awesome, receiving glowing reviews from everyone from the likes of Temple Grandin, who is the author of Animals in Translation, and Ingrid Newkirk, who is also the president of PETA. Kathryn currently lives in Solana Beach, California, with her husband and, to make it all worthwhile, her 3 cats, which I will mention now. We have Chloe, Graham, and Maxine. Now, after the talk, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, so we just ask that you please use the Q&A mic for our virtual and YouTube audiences. And if there are any questions from our remote offices as well, we'll be able to take those. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kathryn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, this is like the college campus of my dreams, not the one I teach on, but the one I wish I taught on. It's been really a great pleasure to see the famous Google. I'm sure all of your authors say that, and I'm sure they all feel it as I do. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I wanted to start out just for a bit of information. How many of you are pet owners? How many of you own a pet or are owned by a pet? How many of you have ever shared your house or life with an animal, a companion animal, at some point? Okay, so a good percentage of you anyway. I was actually hoping to see a few of the dogs here in the audience that I've seen around campus today. I really hoped a couple of them would have come to the talk, but occasionally that happens when I give talks on this book. I have an animal audience as well as a human one. Well, the reason I asked is we take pet ownership or ownership by pets or sharing our life with companion animals, however we want to phrase it, pretty much for granted. And one of the things I think that most people don't realize, and that I myself didn't realize until I started doing the research for this book, is that this is really historically a very recent phenomenon. It wasn't all that long ago that this became a wide-scale kind of practice. People having pets, people having that kind of intimate relationship with animals, that non-human animals, that we pretty much take for granted in our society today. It really was at the beginning of the period that I write about in my book, which is the long 18th century, which really for us begins in the middle of the 17th century, that we started to see this kind of thing developing in a widespread kind of way across social classes, so that although it had always been the practice of at least some people to be close to animals, I mean, throughout human history, there have been individuals who have had some kind of special bonds with animals. I mean, people like St. Francis of Assisi, he's probably one of the most famous, animal-connected people within our kind of history and our legends about people. But in fact, for quite a long time, the practice of keeping companion animals was largely aristocratic. I mean, the people who had both the room and the money and the servants to take care of animals. The notion that more ordinary people would spend their life with animals, would have this kind of close relationship, really was only began to make itself felt in a widespread way at the beginning of the 18th century. So by about 1700, the modern phenomenon of pet keeping was in practice. It was something relatively new at that point, but it was something that became very widespread through the 18th century. Another animal-related issue that we tend to take for granted or don't really think about historically is the question of animal protection. Now, we live in a society in which we take for granted at least some kind of legal protection for at least some kinds of animals. Not all animals, perhaps, but certainly the cats and dogs that we tend to share our lives with, and certain even some kinds of protections for farm animals. But that also is something that's very, very historically recent. And in fact, the world's first national animal protection law was not passed until 1822. And that's essentially what I got interested in. What made that possible? Why, in 1822, did a legislature of a country, in this case Great Britain, the legislature, the Parliament in London, decide finally to pass legislation protecting animals? What made this possible? What made people start to think differently about animals and to think that animals actually deserved protection? So that's kind of where I begin. My book, in a sense, begins with 1822, and then it backtracks to the 150 years prior to that, when those individuals who had always been in some way concerned about animals started to become more in number. And gradually during the 18th century, a social movement coalesced and started to come about. And that's what I try to track. Why did that happen? How did that happen? How did we get to 1822 and the passage of that law? And then 2 years later, in 1824, the founding of the first the first successful animal protection organization, which was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the SPCA, that later in England became the RSPCA, the Royal Society, and of course in the United States was founded as the ASPCA, the American Society. So that's the question that I asked myself as I began to do the work for this book. Now, I'd like to start with an anecdote. Imagine the Houses in Parliament in 1821, the year before the law was finally passed. In 1821, by that point, in the previous 2 decades, there had been 4 other attempts to pass some kind of animal protection legislation, and they had been soundly defeated for a variety of reasons that I can talk about later, particularly if you have questions about them in the question and answer period. So imagine the Houses of Parliament, which if you've ever seen any films of the Houses of Parliament today, of the House of Commons on BBC America, it's a rather raucous place. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was even more raucous than it is today. So the bill was introduced by a flamboyant Irishman whose name was Richard Martin. Richard Martin authored a bill called the Ill Treatment of Cattle Act. And that act covered cattle, which was a term that was used to describe all large domesticated animals. So it covered horses and donkeys as well as cows and sheep and goats, for instance. So at that point, then, you also have to imagine outside the Houses of Commons, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the streets of London. I mean, if you imagine any movie you've ever seen that's been set in the 18th and 19th century, what you obviously have are streets, city streets, and this is true of every city and every town, that are clogged with animals. Animals of all sorts, but particularly horses and donkeys, because they were the primary means of transportation and the primary beasts of burden. You would also have animals like cattle, like cows and sheep, being driven through the streets from the countryside to the slaughterhouses, which were in the center of the city. And this was true of most of the major cities within, not just England, but Europe itself. So you had a street that was congested with animals, a kind of very highly visible animal population. And you had, obviously, along with that animal population, many examples of abuse of animals. I mean, very commonly, people beating their horses or the cows they're trying to drive. It was not uncommon for somebody to beat their horse to death in the street, or their donkey. Lots of starving and ill-treated animals in the streets. So you had, outside of the Houses of Parliament, these constant examples of the mistreatment of these large beasts of burden. And those were the beasts that the legislatures who were the proponents of the bill were trying to address. Okay, so there's a moment in the debate, and it gets very raucous very quickly because lots of legislators think that this is absolutely a hilarious thing to even be debating. And the arguments against the bill were things like, this is the sort of thing that Parliament has no business legislating. This is the sort of issue that should be a matter of individual conscience rather than legislation. This is the sort of thing that really is just a kind of distraction from many more important issues. And it's also the sort of thing that might be the tip of the wedge, that it might be the predecessor, if it's passed, to larger kinds of, other kinds of animal protection. So one member stands up to make his speech, and he says, well, look, if we pass this bill protecting horses and donkeys and cows, why, the next thing you know, somebody is going to come in and introduce a bill designed to protect dogs from ill treatment. Because the house explodes in laughter, and somebody shouts, and cats. And everybody just thinks that this is absolutely hilarious, except, of course, the proponents of the bill. So the notion that, not only do you want to protect these work animals, but we might actually be extending protection to dogs and cats was something that a great many people, the vast majority of people at the time, thought was almost unimaginable, and if they imagined it, it was ridiculous. Nonetheless, by 1821, I should say in 1821, the bill was defeated. But the next year, when the same people came back with the bill, they finally got it passed. So by 1822, there were enough people whose voices in Parliament overrode those scoffers and those ridiculers to make their argument and pass what was a very weak piece of legislation, but the first piece of legislation nonetheless. When the SPCA was founded 2 years later, it was founded with the idea of, first of all, making sure that that legislation was enforced, because a lot of the magistrates, and particularly the constables on the street, were not favorable to this bill, so they would try to ignore it or not enforce the legislation. The SPCA also wanted to press for more laws and stronger laws to protect more animals, just as the opponents feared, and to have stronger laws protecting the animals. And they also wanted to educate the populace by just publicizing issues of animals, what animals were, and animal protection. So they published tracts and that sort of thing. So we have this historical nexus. So my question is, what were the circumstances that sort of underlay this historical moment? Now, during the period immediately prior to this legislation, there were some very commonplace assumptions about animals and the animal nature that still probably the vast majority of people in England or Britain in the early 19th century still felt. There was a long tradition based upon particularly Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian in general, but specifically Christian, of arguing that the stricture of man's dominion, the biblical Hebrew Bible stricture of man's dominion over animals, essentially meant that animals were put on this world by God to be used as humans want. They're entirely for human use. Humans had every right to use them in any possible way they wanted. So that was one kind of commonplace attitude. It wasn't the only attitude you found within Christianity, but it was a dominant one. It was one that became increasingly challenged during the 18th century, but it was still a dominant tradition. Another tradition, which sometimes aligned itself with the Christian one, but also could be viewed separately from it, is the notion that animals were just inferior to humans. They lacked reason. They had no intellect, no understanding in the terms that they used in the 18th century, and that they were had no real emotional capacity either. So, and both of these were reflected in the fact that, as it was argued, animals lacked language. They were not able to speak. This showed their lack of rationality. This showed that they were indeed inferior to humans and therefore were properly subject to human dominion. So you have these two attitudes kind of underlying the ways in which people saw animals and kind of providing the dominant way of people understanding animals. But against these attitudes that were very commonplace, some philosophers even argued that, following the French philosopher Descartes, that animals were even incapable of feeling pain because they were essentially biological organisms. They were beast machines. They were mechanical biological machines. And because of that, really were not capable of feeling pain because you had to have intellect in order to feel pain, and you had to have an immortal soul, which animals lacked. Now, this attitude was not as common in England as it was in France and in Europe, but it still was one of the powerful intellectual currents behind the attitudes towards animals. Okay, so against this notion of animal incapacity and lack of reason, a number of people, singly and then as the century went on together, said and wrote things that started to question the kind of received dominant wisdom that assumed that animals were subordinate, and the idea of animal protection itself would be a completely kind of irrelevant sort of thing. And that there were a number of people that I write about in my book who were, as you can imagine, incredibly eccentric and incredibly colorful people. In order to position yourself in relation to animals against the dominant attitudes of the time, you had to be either incredibly courageous or just maybe a little bit crazy or a little bit eccentric, and you certainly see that in the animals and the animal advocates of the 17th and 18th centuries. So I write about a number of people, a number of individuals who in various ways started to change the dominant attitudes towards animals in the 18th century. One of the people that I'm very fond of, whom I wrote about, was the late 17th century noblewoman and author Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, who really was one of the great eccentrics of the 17th century, but was also, she was eccentric for lots of reasons, and one of which was that she was a published author, which was very unusual both for a woman and an aristocrat, because it was considered improper for a woman and vulgar for an aristocrat to publish. But she engaged in massive publication and philosophical debate, and she had quite a lot to say about animals, and quite a lot to say about human attitudes towards animals, as that she attacked as being just arrogant and simple-minded. And she often argued that, and in their own way, animals had as much capacity in their sphere of being as humans did in theirs, and that human assumptions of superiority to animals were really just short-sightedness. That showed the absence of our own understanding that we would assume these kinds of domination over animals. She wrote and talked enough about animals that one of the major historians of attitudes towards nature and the natural world said that in the 17th century, nobody believed as much in animal capacity as Margaret Cavendish did. And she was also notorious for dressing in men's clothes and just generally being a kind of very spectacular and eccentric, flamboyant woman. Later on in the 18th century, we have a variety of people who wrote and talked about their animals, including people like Samuel Pepys, the diarist, who wrote a lot about his pets. He had dogs and cats, but he also had an eagle and a lion cub at various points. We have people like John Evelyn, a gentleman scientist who was also a diarist who left a record of daily life in late 17th century England. And he himself would often kind of witness experiments done on animals and would write about both being a participant but also having some qualms about whether or not those experiments were entirely legitimate given the suffering that they inflicted upon the animals. Other people would include people like Samuel Johnson, the great Dr. Johnson, who had a series of cats, particularly his cat named Hodge, and in his own way would talk about attitudes towards animals as being short-sighted. His famous cat, Hodge, there's actually a statue of his cat outside of Dr. Johnson's house in London today. He's probably one of the most famous cats of English literature and English history. There were people like, in particular, two major reformists of the late 18th century. Now, one of the reasons that animal protection really started to take off towards the end of the 18th century had to do with the fact that it was an age of revolution and reform. There were revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. It was a time in which existing kinds of power structures were coming into question and coming under attack. It was also an age of reform that maybe fell short of revolution, but you had a number of reform movements developing in the later 18th century, things like prison reform, mental hospital reform, and probably maybe most significantly and most importantly, abolition. The ending of England's involvement in the slave trade, and eventually the ending of slavery itself in the English colonies. And a number of the abolitionists were also proponents of animal welfare, and particularly William Wilberforce, whose name probably is known to you. He's the person who led the parliamentary fight to abolish the slave trade. And it took him years, it took decades of parliamentary battles to abolish England's highly lucrative slave trade. Wilberforce was also kind of famous as an animal lover, and he was also instrumental in getting animal protection legislation passed, finally, when it finally was passed. And he was involved in the introduction of earlier animal protection legislation that did not pass. Another thing that I think was contributing, besides the reformist movements of the later 18th century, were the fact of pet ownership. For one, that more and more people were spending their time. As urbanization increased, as more people moved to the cities, as the Industrial Revolution began, more and more people's only contact with animals were with their pets. And when you have that kind of intimate contact with a dog or a cat, it's very hard to think of that animal as lacking understanding, as lacking feelings, as lacking the capacity to feel pain, or as maybe feeling pain, but pain that isn't significant, that you shouldn't care about or do anything about. So that was important as well. And the fact that the very visibility of animals on the streets in the ever increasingly crowded cities meant that animal abuse was kind of up front, was in people's faces on these clogged streets in a way that it really had not been before historically. So you have that kind of thing as well being extremely important in sort of changing people's attitudes towards animals. So we have the reform movement. We have people like Wilberforce who are engaged in various sorts of reforms. And Wilberforce was engaged in dozens of reform movements, but animal reform was certainly one important one. And then we have the guy who is kind of in some ways, certainly one of the champions of my book, one of the heroes of the last part of my book, who is Richard Martin. And Richard Martin was a member of Parliament from Ireland, from Galway, Ireland, and a particularly kind of eccentric and flamboyant character. He was the sort of person who would stand up to speak and would make so many jokes that after a while all you'd have to do was rise to speak and the members of Parliament would start laughing because they were used to him playing the role of a buffoon. He enjoyed playing that role. He enjoyed playing the role of the kind of bumptious country Irish squire, who was, who could speak in a broad brogue, although he also spoke very correct drawing room English at the same time, who was constantly making jokes, who was, very flamboyant and larger than life. He was also a notorious duelist, which was one of the caricatures of Irishmen at the time, that they would fly into a duel at a moment's notice. I mean, actually, dueling was very popular in England as well, but it became one of the stereotypes of the Irishman. And in Martin's case, he certainly did fight many a duel, and sometimes he was known to punctuate an argument by ripping open his shirt and exposing the scars on his chest that he had gotten from a dueling wound. You have to remember that muskets in the 18th century were not as powerful as today's handguns, or else we would have far fewer members of parliament and certainly no animal protection legislation at this time if they had been more powerful. So he was known as somebody one of whose principal crusades was actually Irish and Catholic emancipation. He was from an Irish Catholic background, although he had been educated as a Protestant, because it was impossible to become a member of Parliament at that time if you were Catholic. There were many discriminatory laws against Catholics. And so one of the things that he did, one of the reasons he went into politics in the first place, was to fight for Catholics, particularly Irish Catholics, but Catholics in England as well. But towards the end of his parliamentary career, he threw himself into the animal protection movement. And he is the one who finally succeeded in writing the act that got passed in 1822. Once upon a time, he was challenged by somebody who was asking him, well, if you care so much for animals, I mean, why do you care so much for animals when, in fact, you are so willing to shed human life in your duels? You're such a duelist, and you risk your own life, and you're willing to fire at somebody else. What does this animal protection stuff mean? And he drew himself up and looked at the person and said, "Sir, an ox cannot hold a pistol." And that's precisely, I think, the kind of thing that he really, and the other animal advocates felt, is that animals, unlike humans, had no voice to speak for themselves. The slave, in the language of the abolitionists, said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Animals could not say something comparable, but animal activists would say in their place, are not they God's creatures too? And it's really a number of kind of things that happened in the later 18th century, a number of confluences brought together the notions that animals were indeed worthy of compassion because they were God's creatures, or they were sentient creatures in their own right, and therefore they had some kind of entitlement to some kinds of protections. Now, it's not the discourse of animal rights today. It's definitely much more a discourse of animal protection than the notion that animals have specific rights. But some of the incipient notion of rights started to come into the conversation as well in the 18th century. And certainly among the advocates for animal protection, people came to that cause from all sorts of different political backgrounds. I mean, that's not unlike today. If you look at animal advocacy, you have people who are both Republicans and Democrats, or who are on the left and the right, who, at least for that issue, at least to some degree, come together for that cause. And that was certainly true in the later 18th century. You had people on one hand who were radical Republicans in the sense that they believed in the abolition of the monarchy, and one of the major animal advocates who wrote one of the first polemics about vegetarianism, John Oswald, actually died fighting for the French Republic across the Channel, the republic that most people in England saw as the enemy rather than the friend. So you have this kind of confluence of interests. But one thing I want to say, and I'll open it up to questions in a minute, one thing that I want to say is that there's often a caricature, both in the 18th century and today, about the animal welfare person, the animal lover, quote unquote, and that's the caricature of the person who really cares for animals but could care less about human beings. Who really, whose sympathies all are directed towards animals, and who could, allow all sorts of human injustices to go on. Now, that's a caricature without, there is probably in some cases some basis in truth. truth. I mean, there are always people you can point to who seem kind of dramatically not to care for human beings and very dramatically to care only for animals. I mean, Leona Helmsley, who left a massive fortune to her dog, might be one such person today. But in fact, I think both today and certainly in the historical past, that kind of thing was more of a caricature than truth. It was promulgated by the opponents of animal legislation rather than the proponents of animal legislation. And in fact, most people at the period that I'm writing about who fought for animal protection, who fought to pass some laws that would give the animals some degree of protection anyway, were people who also saw it as a form of a larger evil, which is the evil of oppression. The oppression of humans in various ways and the oppression of animals were not contradictory sorts of causes, but in fact worked together. They were all parts of the same larger social evil that they were fighting. And so I really always feel very strongly about this. When I was writing this book, I don't know how many times people would say, oh, you're writing a book about animals. Well, what about people? As if the two were contradictory, when actually historically and in the present moment, they're not in the least bit contradictory. They work together. Okay, so those are my prepared comments, and I'd be very happy to entertain questions or to expand on any of the points I made or anything more about the historical rise of animal protection. Yes?
On the subject of people who value non-human animals maybe more than humans, is the sort of radical activism, like direct action, like the recent Santa Cruz bombings, is that something that's very new, or has that been from the start?
Well, I don't think you had that kind of radicalism at the period that I'm writing about, although it certainly starts to develop in the 19th century. Really around anti-vivisection, people who were opposed to live animal experiments, particularly the practice of dissection of live animals. Now remember, we're talking about an era before anesthetic. So, scientific experiments and demonstrations that involved live animals would involve tying an animal down or nailing an animal down and dissecting it while it's still conscious. And I won't go into any more detail about that. I've read many graphic instances. And this is something that really obviously moved people. And so the period after I write about, the later 19th century, the Victorian period, my book pretty much sort of stops just at the beginning of the Victorian period. You see more of that kind of thing. And when the ASPCA was founded in New York State, in New York City, in 1866, the proponents, like Henry Bergh, who was the founder and first president of the ASPCA, would engage in types of civil disobedience in the sense that, or not civil disobedience exactly, but obstructionist, in the sense that he would find carts that had been overloaded and were actually against the law because they managed to pass a law that did, that like Martin's law, prevented some types of animal abuse. And he would order the horse to be unharnessed in the middle of New York City, all the people to get off of the bus, and therefore create a giant traffic jam. And so that kind of, of demonstration was certainly there in the tactics. And some of the British animal people did that sort of thing as well. But the turn to types of violence, I tend to locate primarily as more of a 20th century phenomenon. And I would say particularly a post-World War II phenomenon, second half of the 20th century and current. And I mean, Animal Liberation Front, for instance, I think is moving more and more to more directly confrontational and perhaps life-threatening activities than they were a few decades ago, for instance. Yeah, so I do see that. Although I'm sure you can probably search the historical records and find instances, individual instances of that sort of thing. But I think as a group effort, it's more modern. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So Peter Singer gets a lot of credit for founding or jump-starting the modern animal rights movement with Animal Liberation. And in my reading about the philosophy behind animal welfare, I rarely ever see a reference to any kind of idea or historical event before the second half of the 20th century. So my question to you is, to what extent does the modern animal welfare movement borrow from ideas formed in the historical animal protection movement, and to what extent is it a more separate phenomenon?
You're talking about welfare itself as opposed to animal rights? Are you making a separation
the modern
between the two?
movement for the well-being of animals.
Okay, in
like
general.
PETA and what's been done recently since, like what Peter Singer gets credit for with his book.
Okay, I mean, the first thing I think to start with is that the notion that the animal, let's just call it the humane movement, which is the term that people use as a kind of umbrella term to talk about all of the various animal protection organizations. It exists in today's United States on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have groups that really identify themselves as animal welfare, which means that usually they are not challenging the existing hierarchy of relationship between humans and animals. What they are doing is working for humane treatment of animals. So they don't, for instance, advocate vegetarianism or veganism. They don't necessarily advocate an end to animal experimentation, that kind of thing. On the other hand, more on the other side of the spectrum, you have the organizations that are more oriented towards animal rights, and PETA would be one of those. ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, further more extreme. The Humane Society of the United States is usually lumped as an animal rights organization as well, and the animal welfare groups, I think, can trace a direct line to the circumstances that I'm talking about historically. The notion that animals deserve some kind of humane treatment, the emphasis upon compassion, but not really challenging the existing power relationships. Animal rights, on the other hand, that concept does challenge the existing power relationship between animals. I mean, an animal rightsist, depending upon how they interpret animal rights, and animal rights is a kind of a big, messy area too, with the people within the movement who share their philosophical background are fighting against each other all the time. There are those within animal rights who would call Peter Singer an animal welfarist and kind of a sellout. There are others who look to Peter Singer very much as a model for talking about animals' interests and animals' rights. So they would go back to, there are certain kinds of suggestions in the period that I'm talking about that animals have some kind of rights that are separate from human rights. And it's not just negative rights, that is, animals have the right not to allow us to do certain things to them. I mean, as opposed to the idea that we have the rights to do anything to animals. The negative rights idea would say that there are some limitations to our own rights as regards our treatment of animals. And so you find some of that kind of discourse in the earlier period, but I think that the modern notion of animal rights really does go back to the 70s, the mid-70s, when Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation. A follow-up question?
Yeah, so kind of just to expand or clarify my question then, the earlier efforts for animal protection were more based on like a gut feeling that it's wrong to treat animals this way and less rigorously philosophically based. Would that be the correct way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that if anything, it's definitely much less rigorously philosophically based, and it's also would find its origins in biblical traditions, in religion. I mean, some of the first people who actually talked in any systematic way and preached in any systematic way about animals and our duty of compassion were clergymen. In England, particularly Anglican clergymen, who argued that animals are God's creatures. They have a right to being in themselves, that God created them not just for our purposes, but as beings in themselves. God created them before he created humans, they would argue. So that shows that they have some kind of existence separate from our uses of them. And a number of these, I mean, you would get a little bit of the incipient rights talk, but most of these people would talk about how God judges us on how well we treat animals. And there was even a pretty lively debate going on about whether or not animals had immortal souls. Some clergy argued that in fact they did, that, that if God gave us immortal souls, surely he gave other parts of his creation immortal souls. They may not be quite the same souls of us. Their afterlife might be not quite the same afterlife as ours. It's probably lesser somehow, but they nonetheless had an afterlife, and that was the reason we were to treat them kindly. Other arguments said, from this point of view, said, no, animals do not have immortal souls. There's no justification for that in the Bible. You don't see any kind of evidence that that's true. However, their lack of immortal souls was an argument for treating them kindly, because this life is all they have. And therefore, in fact, treating animals compassionately was more important than treating humans compassionately, because humans had an afterlife to look ahead to, in which this life of suffering, of anguish, whatever, is just a moment, just a tiny moment in comparison to all eternity. Animals had only that tiny moment. So if their moment is filled with suffering, how great an injustice, how great a cruelty is that? So you have these two different, kind of biblical or theological arguments.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
Hi.
Hi.
I find it interesting that the animal protection movement sort of started, am I talking to the mic? Sort of started with farm animals, or like sort of labor animals, and now I think the general populace, I think you know what I'm going to ask,
Yes.
seems to care a lot more about pets and domestic animals than like actual farm animals. When did this sort of shift occur, and what are the historical underpinnings of that?
Well, first of all, the first law within England that was passed that actually governed those dogs and cats that we're so much worried about in the earlier debates was in 1835, an act that strengthened Martin's Law of 1822 and extended it to cover other animals as well. In fact, all animals, so that even, these are very weak laws we're talking about, I should say. I mean, these were less than a misdemeanor. We're talking about fines, of not a great deal for mistreatment of animals, but it was something, it was a start. And so you get the notion that these pets, essentially these domesticated animals, could be protected. I think that the increasing fact of pet keeping, the preponderance of literature the kind of pre-Walt Disney representations of animals that actually started in the 18th century, but you see them proliferate during the Victorian period, had a lot to do with this as well. Sentimentalizing animals, sentimentalizing our bonds with the animals that we are closest to. Horses sometimes, but particularly dogs and cats or our birds or whatever. And that in fact, the modern animal movement has historically been much more focused on abuses to cats and dogs and other pets than to other animals. Now, I must say that, though, very recently, the humane movement in the United States is starting to go back to those originary moments and talking about farm animals. I mean, do you know about Proposition 2 that will be on the November ballot? Very important proposition, the proposition that will outlaw certain forms of cruelty to farm animals. One writer on animals, Jeffrey Mason, says that actually the more correct word to use in today's industrial agriculture is farmed animals. Farm animals conjures up this image of sheep frolicking in the pastures. I mean, what we have are these industrial plants in which animals are raised and processed. And so the farmed animals, this is an act that would protect farmed animals. What it will do specifically is to outlaw gestation crates for sows, outlaw veal crates, and outlaw battery farming of chicken. And those are three very egregious abuses of animals within our industrial agriculture system. So I want to encourage you to get out and vote yes on Proposition 2 in November. But I should say that this proposition, which is being spearheaded by the Humane Society of the United States, has also arisen in other state legislatures. And there are bills in Congress, too, national bills that would seek to address issues of farmed animals. And people like Michael Pollan, although he's obviously not a vegan or even a vegetarian, I mean, his writing bullbaiting, which has been enormously popular. I think he spoke here at Google, a couple of years ago at least, if not more recently. His work has been enormously influential in exposing actually the kind of treatment of animals within our industrial agricultural system. Peter Singer has written a recent book that talks very much about the same thing. So you do have this, this growing kind of concern that's actually coming back full circle to the first concerns of Martin's Act and the first legislation in Parliament. Well, just one more thing to say really quickly is that of those bills that were defeated before 1822, before the Ill Treatment of Cattle Act actually passed, the first two animal protection bills were actually bills to ban blood sports of bull baiting and bear baiting, bull baiting in particular, and they didn't get very far, partially because the aristocrats and gentry who populated the Houses of Parliament thought that, okay, if you ban the working classes, or what they saw as the working classes sports, then the banning of fox hunting, and shooting, other kinds of aristocratic sports would not be far behind. So that's part of the reason that the attention turned to the large animals, that Martin wrote his act to cover them, and really stayed away from the whole issue of bull baiting, because that bill, even in 1822, would never have passed, precisely because it threatened so many interests. Yeah. Yes.
I read that recently the Humane Society donated $2,500 to the FBI to help find ALF accusees. And I was wondering if that kind of infighting is a new thing, or if that's been going on a long time.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's, I assume that that's true. I don't know of that particular incident, but I do know that, there is infighting. There is a lot of disagreement. There's a kind of, on their animal rights, and that to call somebody an animal welfarist is a slur. It's like an obscenity, you animal welfarist, so there is that kind of friction. But I think it's also true that a number of different groups, and I'm not talking about the ALF now so much as, let's talk about more kind of mainstream but very rights-oriented group like PETA. That would be the one that most people know and a lot of people have some issues about. But they will join with the Humane Society and to some degree the ASPCA on working for certain types of legislation or exposing certain types of abuses of animals. So although the organizations and philosophies of a lot of the animal welfare groups or animal rights groups might be different, they do tend to work together a lot more than you might think when you read about the infighting. Now, I think that people in the mainstream animal rights, animal welfare movement, the mainstream humane movement, would argue that that action, direct action like the ALF and other kind of what has been branded by the government as terrorist groups, actually harms the movement. It actually harms because all of these groups are to some degree or another incrementalists. They say, what is more important to, alleviate animal suffering, at least for some animals in the here and now, and work towards greater alleviation, or take an all or nothing approach. In fact, during the bull baiting and bear baiting arguments in Parliament in 1800, the opponents of the bill argued precisely an all or nothing approach. They said, well, unless you ban all forms of cruelty, we can't legislate on anything. And this, of course, was a ruse to, very successfully argue against doing anything. And I think that many of the strategists within the mainstream humane movement today would make the argument that this kind of all or nothing sort of thing is counterproductive to any kind of, continued advance for animals, and also counterproductive in the sense that there are possibilities for alleviating the suffering of some animals right now. if Proposition 2 passes, it will alleviate the suffering almost immediately of tens of thousands of animals, and not every animal, yes, but tens of thousands of animals, and it's a beginning. And Richard Martin used to argue, when he got that all or nothing argument used against him in Parliament, he used to argue, well, okay, imagine a shipwreck. There are, 500 people drowning, and I can only save 250 of them. Should I let them all drown, or should I save the 250 that I can save? And so that's an incrementalist argument. You can't save everybody, but isn't it worthwhile saving some of them? And I think that's very much the argument that would make that philosophical distinction between most of the humane movement groups, no matter what their philosophies are, and the activists who really do engage in a kind of all or nothing sort of strategy or set of strategies. Questions? Okay, thank you very much.